Welcome to the InfoMullet YouTube channel. If you enjoy this content, please like or share. And if you'd like to support the InfoMullet by becoming a mulleteer, visit us on Patreon. We appreciate your support. Welcome, everyone. Today is December 31st of the end of a very long year. This is the InfoMullet New Year's Eve 2021 Ask Me Anything. We are ending 2020, and this is your emotional support donkey, Bonky, and I am your Chief Mulleteer, Timothy Clancy. And what we're going to do tonight is every year on the InfoMullet, we have kind of a tradition where we ring in the new years by making forecasts of the year ahead. And that was fun and games. And when we started it in 2018 for 2019, everyone's had some funds. And then in 2019, one of the people asked me, what keeps you up at night? And you'll see this as, you know, what is the thing that keeps you up at night? And I think they were suspecting climate change. Like, it seemed like it was one of those questions that would be climate change. But my best worst forecast for last year's version of this was, it said, you know, the thing that keeps me up at night, it's antibacterial resistant bacteria or novel viruses. And here we are. So mea culpa, my bad. No, we got a lot going on tonight. It's going to be fun. This is supposed to be, we got a couple things going on with audience participation. You know, this is the New Year's, right? And I'm not Anderson Cooper or Casey Kasem, and we don't have, like, you know, the awards. So throughout the night, make some awards up. You know, what are the end of year awards that you want to give yourself? You want to recognize the InfoMullet for something. Maybe Bonky deserves an award. Maybe another mulleteer does. Make up some good end of year awards, and I'll capture them in the comments as we go on. And then also share what you're up to. We're all living this right now, where we're in our various places, you know, socially isolating, staying distance. But what are you doing on the New Year's to kind of pass the time? Are you watching Battlestar Galactica again? Are you, you know, playing a board game, watching me, listening to me, whatever? Just, you know, throw some of those on there in the comments. And we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. Let me first do some quick call outs. Welcome, Guy, Charles, Jay, good to see you, Shama, Laura, Valeria, yay, Derek, Stephen, Jeremy, Celia, and Joe. I think I got all the folks I've seen. Yep. So the awards, you're already starting with the awards. If you're coming in, we're making up awards. We're handing it out to folks. You know, you could make up an award even in the middle of the show and hand it out to someone. Best comment of 2021. Yeah, so if you haven't had it yet, check out the Patreon, www.patreon.com/infomullet. All the forecasts you're going to see tonight came from senior mulleteers, Medici mulleteers, and our mega mulleteers. So they suggested the forecast request. Then we turned it around and gave the mulleteers, the entire group of mulleteers, a chance to vote on them. So these forecasts are what you want to see. It reflects what you're interested in for 2021 and the year ahead. And that's kind of how I do this. Now, I did limit it this year to only doing 14 forecasts. I did 18 last year, and that got to be a real chore. But before we jump into the new forecast, there's a question of how did I do on last year's forecast, right? I've been putting, if you go up to the YouTube, I finally got all the videos uploaded. There's a playlist out there. It has all the 2020 reviews of the forecasts I made and whether I got them right or wrong. And at the end of the day, there were 18 forecast requests. 16 of them could be well evaluated. 2 of them ended up being these kind of, over the next 10 years, what do you think will happen? I gave myself a scoring system, which is I gave myself 1 point for getting an accurate forecast. I gave myself a half point for getting the contingency in which if I was wrong, that's how I would be wrong. I gave myself a half point there, and I gave myself a quarter point for sort of a partial credit. And the result was I got 14 points when you assemble them all out of 16 questions that could be evaluated. And that turns into an accuracy rating of 87.25%. Now, this is a very scientific method, and I got to tell you, if I was just flipping a coin behind a screen you couldn't see and telling you how well I would do, I would only score 60 to 70%. So clearly, these forecasts are better, at least the way I score. It's kind of like whose line is it anyway? The scoring is made up and the points don't matter. But yeah, it was 87.25%. What's interesting is when I scored myself for the 2019 forecast, same exact score. So you can either say that I'm in a consistent range of getting an 87.25% accuracy, and as always, if you add those decimal points, it makes it seem more accurate, or I just make things up in a consistent fashion and can't think of anything creative. So yeah, let's go ahead and get started. Let's see here. find myself. And again, if you're joining late, say hello to the fellow Mulleteers. What we're doing for audience participation, share what you're up to, share what's going on. And we're doing made-up end-of-year awards, so pass some awards on to each other, and let's have some fun. So, yeah, store plug. There we go. First forecast of the 2021 Ask Me Anything New Year's Eve forecast. This comes from Mike Lyons. With a Biden administration, do you see a major change in right to work or at-will laws in 2021? So, by the way, just for some context, I'm going to do a bunch of independent ones, and then probably around question 8 is where I get in the COVID ones, because I think a lot of people understand there were a lot of COVID-related ones. I put all of those in an order because there's a certain order that makes sense in. So if you're only here for COVID, hit the mute button, come back in an hour, check it out. It'll be around question 8 or 9 is when I start getting it. But anyways, first question. With a Biden administration, do you see a major changes being made in right to work and at-will laws in 2021? So for those who aren't familiar, this is actually one of the biggest pet peeves I have is on these terms, right to work and at will, because people are constantly getting them confused. And so first of all, and I appreciate Mike asking this question, he used them in the correct context, so it's a great thing. What are we talking about? In US labor law, the term right to work does not mean what 99% of the people think it means. Everyone thinks if I have a right to work or not, that means someone can fire me. No, right to work has to do with union laws, and it's something called a machine shop. If your state is a machine shop, that means if there's a union in your company or organization representing the employees, you have to join that union as a condition of your employment. That's what right to work means. Now, across the board, there's probably 2 or 3 states that are not right to work. I think Washington State is one of them. There's a few other, but for the most part, the vast majority of states are right to work. So that's what right to work means. It doesn't have to do with anything of how you can be terminated or under what causes you can be fired or hired. It just means if there's a union, do you have to join it? Now, at will employment is basically, this is the one that I think everyone means when they say right to work. At will means that you can be fired at will of the company, and it also means you can be hired at will. And that's a part a lot of people don't remember because most people are focused on the firing part. At will employment means that barring one of the 7 protected conditions, gender, race, religious, political preference, family affiliation, now sexual orientation. There's now 7 or I guess 8 protected classes. If it's a circumstance outside of one of those 8, company can fire you for any reason. And so at will employment is every single state in the country. I don't think there's a single state that doesn't have at will. And what Mike is asking is, hey, we got a Democratic administration. He's got union support. Are we going to see changes because of this? Well, there's some good news and some bad news. The bad news is that these laws are at the state level. They don't really, it's not something that the federal government can change at the federal level. Every single state adopts these laws and they have little versions or tweaks of it. It doesn't adjust it at the federal level. It's not something you can just wave your hand and say, well, I'm president now, I sign an executive order and at will is gone. And from the last election, you can see that the control of state legislatures that would change this, that's the state legislature plus the governor, is very mixed between Republican and Democrat. So my forecast for 2021 is that there will not be much change at all in state laws of right to work or at will. But wait, there's 2 other ways that you can change labor relations. And I think that gets to the core of what Mike's asking about. First is by federal legislation. And there's something that's called the the PRO Act, Protecting Rights to Organize in Law. This is a very major revision to labor laws. So there's a whole lot of federal laws that protect and lay out the boundaries of what you can and cannot do as a company when a union is organizing. And these often are the point of contention at the federal level, because this violating these laws is what gets you in trouble. And it's the extent that these laws are strict or loose about unions and organizing really goes to a large degree of how effective unions can be in organizing. However, as a federal legislation and a federal law, you're going to need the Senate to pass this law. The Democrats control the House, but by a smaller margin they did. and the Senate is up to two runoffs in Georgia. But even if Democrats pick up both seats, they've only got a 50-50 split. I don't think you're going to be able to get the PRO Act passed in until at least something changes in 2022. So again, no major changes on the federal legislation level for unions. But last but not least, the final way in which labor laws are implemented in the United States is something called the National Labor Relations Board, NLRB. That is a 5-member board. It's an independent agency that the president can appoint members to the board. They have 5-year terms, so they last longer than the president who appointed them, and they're staggered out. And that board adjudicates labor disputes. And this board was sort of got stacked by Trump appointees. There's current a Republican majority, a Republican appointee majority. And this has, you know, if you think about states determine at will and right to work laws in the states, the federal legislation can determine how unions can organize by federal law. The NLRB is the independent agency that basically is the referee of those laws. If you have a dispute, you go to the NLRB and they make a call. And just like any administrative agency, they have a lot of discretion to set precedent by how they rule. So the third option for influencing labor relations in the U.S. is going to be through Biden, President Biden, appointing members to this NLRB. And again, unfortunately, Mike, I don't have good news for you here either. The next NLRB vacancy actually comes up in August of 2021, and we assume Biden filled that. It takes a Senate-confirmed appointee. Let's assume he can get it past the Senate. That will still, even when you do that, it's currently 4-1. That will just change it to a 3-2 Republican majority. So you're still going to have a Republican majority. The next vacancy after that is December 2022, I think, and it may be, you know, at the end of 2022, you get the person in. It will be in 2023, the third year of his term, that Biden gets a Democratic appointment majority on the NLRB. Now, if he gets, I'm not saying there's going to be much going on in the year ahead. In 2021, don't expect a lot of movement in labor relations. As each year goes, though, that chance goes up, with a contingency being that if the Democrats have large gains in 2022, that's going to change the nature of the Senate. That may be where you see the PRO Act pass. So let me pause here, see if there's any questions. Say hello to some folks. Good to see you, Mike. Yeah, 87% solid, better than 80% solution. Jennifer, good to see you. New Year's Eve. If you're joining in late and wondering what everyone's doing, I'm encouraging people to share what they're doing on New Year's Eve and make up some awards, some end-of-year awards to give to yourself, give to your family, or give to Mulleteers. So, all right. So, what's the next question? That was the first question of the night, and unfortunately, no change in 2021 for labor relations. Question number 2. Do you believe U.S. allies will or should regain trust in the U.S. regarding foreign policy and interventions? This comes from Mulleteer Laura, Senior Mulleteer Laura, and I appreciate this. This is a continual trend. This is not a new concern. This has been asked in variations in 2019, 2018, and 2019, 2020, and now again in the 2021. So this is an interesting question. I've said before that trust and belief in U.S. is not something, you know, as U.S. consumers, we tend to think, wow, they like Obama, therefore they like us, or they don't like Trump and they don't like us. Allies' determination of how they view the U.S. is almost entirely based on how we actually perform in things that matter to them. And I think right now we're obviously really in the 8 ball. Or behind the 8 ball. We are way down in a hole in terms of how we are perceived for doing things that matter to them. And you look at it in a couple major ways. NATO, you know, we've lost a lot of ground in NATO, but I think that's strong enough to recover. The problem is, the reason it's strong enough to recover is it's going to be Europe is being challenged by Russia and Turkey. Turkey is a member of NATO. So there's a kind of weirdness in there going on, that like the thing that I think will make NATO matter is something that is a part of NATO. And there's a Turkey forecast later. I don't want to get too far in it. But another thing that's interesting, with the European Union, the United Kingdom and the European Union was always the Virginia in like as the colonies and the states of the Confederate Articles are to the U.S. before the Constitution. You know, Virginia played that role of we don't want to centralize anything. Jefferson's famous for decentralize everything, no central power, no federal power, anti-federalist. You know, as Virginia played that role in the formation of the United States and the Constitution, so too did the United Kingdom play that role for the European Union. Well, I think they got a settlement finally, and with a couple days left coming under the wire, the United Kingdom leaves the European Union beginning in January. And that means that this anchor for sort of anti-federalist momentum goes away with it. And it's not to say that there aren't groups. You know, Hungary is obviously there's a lot of in Hungary, Austria, things like that. There's still some pushing against European Union federalism, but a big pusher of that, the United Kingdom, is leaving the European Union, and that means the European Union may increasingly look to Germany and France and not to the U.S. So, you know, especially when it comes to COVID-19 response, we have absolutely not demonstrated the kind of sufficiency. Asia, I talked about last week. We've dilly-dallied in there. We've had several presidents who tried to make the South China Seas and East Asia policy. I think Japan is going to continue making local alliances in the region. They have that alliance I mentioned, that military defensive alliance with Australia. South Korea is going to be looking to get in on some of those. India as well. The area where we may have some change, and I'll get into this a forecast later, is in the Arab states with in relation to Israel, Arab relations, and the U.S. But overall, the forecast for 2020, there's not a lot of opportunities for the U.S. to regain trust in alliances. And I think where it will happen will probably be in NATO, but that will be offset by a rise in European Union federalism and sort of relatively independence, and these local areas creating their own local deals with or without the U.S. So that's my forecast there. Yeah, Mike, so let's go through here. Ishmael, good to see you. Lisa, good to see you. I'm reading some of these, what people are doing. Dog sitting for the night, firework phobia, looking for the memento mori, going for 2020 survival. You put what you do, Ishmael, is you put all the COVID masks under your pillow tonight, and in the morning, the COVID tooth fairy will either give you a memento mori coin or a bunch of moldy face masks. So, you know, 2020. Lisa, New Year's Eve plans, playing Jackbox games on my Discord server and answering all texts that, hey, aren't you from Elmira, Ohio? Online gaming plans. Can't keep giving, yeah, okay, so here's some questions here. Mike's asking about, we can't keep giving our allies an allowance, eventually you need to get out and get a job. I think that's I don't know if it's an allowance so much as an investment. It's a lot cheaper to provide a funding it's a lot cheaper to pay for diplomacy now than it is to pay for bullets later. And I think that's the investment that we've seen in the Europe front, especially in Egypt and Israel. I know Glass and I have talked about this. A lot of these things we pay, they look like big dollars until you compare them to any war we've ever been in. And it's certainly going to be a lot more expensive if we have to go deploy over. So I think there's a valid point about what the shares of percentages are and the allocations, but I don't necessarily view it as an allowance. I view it more as an investment, which is of course what every accountant says when they want to say something's an expense that's actually a benefit. Canada. So Valeria is asking about Canada. U.S. relations with Canada have really been struggling, I think, and the kinds of behaviors we've had, from sending troops up on the border to stiffing vaccine distribution to causing problems with their acquisition of PPE. Again, I think Canada and the U.S. sort of have a special relationship from proximity. There will be better relations from a personality standpoint, but again, it's going to come down to U.S. actions. So as much as President Biden may go on a goodwill tour, I think what Canada is going to be looking at is, hey, neighbor with house that's really on fire and very close to ours, what are you doing about that? Are you putting it out or not? And I think the confidence of the alliance and working with the U.S. and Canada is going to be based on actions that do it. Now, another thing is helping Canada out with its current Chinese dispute. Canada took a solid for the U.S. when it detained some Huawei executives 2 or 3 years ago, and that's created a big diplomatic spat between Canada and China. And the U.S. was kind of like, thanks for nothing, but talk to you later. So, you know, to the extent that the U.S. can help in that, if to the extent Canada wants help, there might be some of that having partnership policies where we have an integrated approach to global issues might help, but I think the biggest thing Canada is going to be looking with, and it's going to be the main thrust for the rest of the evening, is what's going on south of the border. Do we trust you to have COVID-19 under control? Because our economy is very dependent on this mutual working together and working well. And from where we're standing, you got a lot of fires going on you need to put out. Seeing other people's plans, make Chinese food and try and stay awake till midnight. Play Cyberpunk and remind myself it's fiction. We aren't headed in that direction. Jeff, ask me about that at the end of the forecast, whether you think we're going to dystopian. So next question. Question number 3. And this, I teased this a little bit in the last one. How do Arab-Israeli relations progress in 2021, considering the fact that they're finding common cause in Iran? This comes from Mike, Muleteer Mike. And Mike, if you're playing with crayons tonight, no judgment. It's a safe area. You do what you want. You have your own fun there. So the Arab-Israeli relations, this is an area that had a lot of change. So if you had asked me, and several people did about Israel elections, I'll get to that later. But if you had asked me in 2019 and 2020, I would have said, I don't think there's going to be much change in it. But one of the most understated changes in 2020 were the outgrowths of what are called the Abraham Accords. And these are controversial. I'm not saying this is a cut and dried interpretation, but I think because of COVID and the elections and everything else, we have sort of underplayed what's going on with the Abraham Accords. Now, think about this. Prior to 2020, the only Arab countries that had normalized relations with Israel were Egypt and Jordan. And it goes back to that investment clause. Ever since the 1977 peace accords with Egypt, the U.S. has been paying Egypt and Israel to have peace. We're in the middle of it with the Suez Canal. We have the troops there, and we fund. Those are the 2 largest foreign aid recipients. Usually, Colombia might come in there occasionally over the time, but over the last 40 years, that's where a lot of our money goes. And guess what? There's been no state-on-state conventional wars, even though there were a whole bunch of them before that. So in a way, the Egypt-Israeli normalized relations is a good example of how you can make an investment. And yeah, it looks like it's expensive, but there's also no state-on-state wars there. So that was up to 2020. Now, Trump caught a lot of flack, and again, it's a controversial decision, but part of his policy in the first half of his administration was this pro-Israeli policy where he basically abandoned the U.S. position of the 2-state solution. He effectively recognized Jerusalem as the capital, and this caused a lot of tension and outcry, a lot of discussion. This wasn't a really good idea. But at the time, there was a lot of murmurings underneath the surface that wait and watch what the Arab countries do after this. They may give a period of time to have the Arab street, vent their frustration, their feeling of betrayal to the Palestinians, but then the Arab countries might come in line. And it's interesting. I don't know if one is caused by the other, but the Abraham Accords started coming out just earlier this year and began to manifest the tangible outcoming of that belief that you would have normalized relations. And it's not a lot of countries. There's a few of them so far. So we have Bahrain, UAE, United Arab Emirates, Sudan, and Morocco. Now, I got to be very clear. The way we went about this is not Bismarckian diplomacy with highfalutin ideals. We bought a lot of these these normalization agreements. There was a purchase plan involved in this. For example, in Morocco, it just happened. Morocco has a claim on a disputed territory that almost no one believes is valid, and it's been the United States' position for years that this claim is invalid. And Morocco here, we're talking northwestern Africa, or Western Mediterranean. The normalization that Trump did, he recognized the Morocco claim on that land. That was so controversial that James Baker, President Bush Sr.'s Secretary of State, considered one of the mastermind diplomats of the current era, came out and said, this is a horrible thing. The UAE, they had a huge arms sale that tied up with this normalization. These normalizations were not just out of goodwill. They were very strategic interests. And if those strategic interests get unwound by Biden, we may see these. If the arms sales gets blocked by the UAE, if Morocco recognition of the territorial status gets reversed, you may see these normalizations in jeopardy. But I think what's going on is there's kind of like a reversed first mover effect. No Arab state wanted to be the first one to normalize ties with Israel for fear of the backlash. So there's a lot of big and very influential Arab countries that haven't normalized ties yet. Saudi Arabia is the biggest one. I think they're watching. I think Mohammed bin Salman is watching what happens, and they're going to see what's the reaction, what's the pushback. Because there is a very real politic reason that Arab and Israel allies may reconfigure their relationship to one another, leaving Palestine on the short end of the stick. And that has to do with the second part of this question, that is Iran. Iran has, under Soleimani, tried to do a double envelopment of the Gulf Cooperation Council states. That's the states of the Arab states in the Persian Gulf: Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, UAE, Bahrain, Oman, those areas. They obviously have played a role in Yemen. They intervened in Syria. They're trying to build a railroad. The Arab states are feeling encircled by this Iranian presence. The death of Soleimani continues to have major ramifications in that Iranian expansion and encirclement stopped. And you're seeing it's sort of a bridge too far. They're not able to hold on to those. And Israel is getting a lot of, I think, favorable play, at least with the leaders of the Arab states, for constantly hitting Iran and Syria. And there may be a situation where, let's say, there's a couple contingencies here that may play this out. Let's say there's a major attack on a nuclear facility by Iran. That could aggravate the street of the Arab street. I don't know if it would, though. It might. But coming up is the anniversary of Soleimani's death. And there is a huge U.S. naval presence moving in the Gulf right now because of this anniversary on Soleimani's death. Iraq's got a lot of problems with, what's going on. We need to protect the embassies. The whole state is kind of disintegrating. But there's a fear of Houthi attacks and Iranian attacks in retaliation for the Soleimani death over the next week. So if you're watching something, if you want to, watch something, keep an eye on what's going on in the Gulf. And here's the thing. If Iran makes attacks and there's any significant fighting, my guess is Israel will want to come in just to get a couple extra shots on Iran. That's what they're doing in Syria. Israel's taken every shot they can get against Iran and Syria. And if Israel does that, that may show the Arabs that there's a not that we want to get along because we like you and we don't have cultural tension, but there's a real politic reason to ally with Israel. And that may lead to some of these normalizations getting a little bit more legs underneath them than just they got bought for by a weapons purchase or a weapons sale from the U.S. or we recognize something. There may be real legs because the Arabs are looking to the east with Iran and to the north with Turkey. These are very complex relationships. I'm sort of simplifying them there. But there's an area in there where you may see this sort of Abraham Accords play out. So my forecast for 2021 is Arab-Israeli relations continue to strengthen. May see more countries come in and normalize. We'll probably not see countries remove the normalization they've already offered. That's the forecast for 2021. Going back, let's see. Some more New York plans, addressing holiday cards, realizing that putting them off for another day or so is fine. Playing Candyland and Hot Wheels. I hear Animal Crossing is nice, but looks like a fun way to pass the New Year's. Meal planning, yeah, meal planning's meal planning and meat planning. These are things, again, if you're joining us late, one of the things we're doing, say hello to your fellow folks, share what you're working on New Year's Eve, come up with some end of year awards that you deserve, you think someone else deserves, you want to give to Bonky or myself, and we'll just put them in the comments there. So next question continues the foreign policy forecast. Question number 4, and this is another one that's had a couple years now. Will Turkey be stronger, the same, or weaker in its regional hegemony by the end of 2021 than it is now? So for those who have watched either the InfoMullet blog going back years, I've been documenting this evolution Turkey's been going under really since 2004 when Erdogan took power and the Justice Party took power, and then it really began playing out during the Arab Spring. There was sort of an effort where Turkey tried to make a play and it got pushed back. But really in the last 3 or 4 years, Turkey has emerged as a regional hegemon. And I think 2020 was the year that this became apparent. And I think my forecast for 2021, Turkey gets stronger relative to its peers. It continues the momentum. It has now swapped positions with Russia. If you think 5 years ago when we say, who has the most influence in this area other than the United States, people would have said, well, Russia. I'm telling you, Turkey has spanked Russia 3 times now. Once in Syria, once in Libya, and once in Armenia, Azerbaijan. And it's doing it in its near space. I mean, Armenia, Azerbaijan is not far from Russia. Libya's a little further away. You can say, okay, that's distant. But it's not like asking Russia to go across the world and defend it. This is in Russia's near space. And what's going on is the sort of the modern warfare that is the new way of conducting warfare. Turkey is the best at doing this. Now, I'm not going to say that the U.S. isn't good, but we have not demonstrated this capability. If you want to say the #1 demonstrated military capability in the world right now for 21st century warfare, it's Turkey, and it rests on 3 things. It rests on drones, not the world's most high-tech drones or the world's fanciest. That the U.S. probably has that. We got some really fancy stuff, but they have a very good intermediate drone capability. Some of those drones carry jammers, and they're the jamming of the air defense. So if you think about drones, you got these drones flying out. Well, we're just go shoot them down with anti-air missiles, right? Well, these drones, there's a jamming capability that has proved completely able to shut down Russian anti-air defense systems. I mean, it's been completely effective. So now what you've got is Turkey is able to establish air superiority in drones, and then those drones are now linked increasingly to very high precision artillery. So this is the 3-legged stool. You have drones that jam, which keeps your other drones from getting shot down. Those drones then loiter over sites and provide very precise information to high precision artillery that comes in and just obliterates whatever's going on in that area. And this is where, if you've been watching any of the videos coming out of Armenia, Azerbaijan, tanks, APCs, other teams' artillery, these are all easy targets. And the drones themselves are carrying missiles. So if the artillery misses, the drone can pick off the last one. This also helps too in that when it comes to propaganda and social media, nothing beats a live video anymore. So you can say, there are no troops in downtown, capital city of our Republic of Artash. That's impossible. And the Azerbaijan just releases the drone video that they've got because they got these drones with cameras. You can release tons of, you can edit and release the ones that show hits, kind of like the Gulf War. But Turkey has built this military capability up, and it is using it now almost without transactional costs. They don't have to put troops on the ground for this. They're working with indigenous fighters most often. It's not a hugely expensive thing. So they've got a military package. And then you look at the other factors. Their economy, and with COVID, they're doing better than almost any other peer in the region, maybe perhaps Greece, but Greece doesn't have the military capability. Iran, you'd normally talk about Iran. Iran is suffering under COVID-19. Its economy is in shambles. There's a lot of domestic tension. Turkey, on the other hand, even though he's an authoritarian rule, President Erdogan has stabilized and has strong national support. So you've got the elements you would need for a continuing strengthening of regional hegemony. You've got a military capability that can't be matched currently and is being used, and the willingness to use it. You've got a strong, fairly strong economy relative to 2020, and good response to COVID-19 relative to everyone else. And you have a stable leadership that has at least sufficient support. I think Turkey continues to move on. Now, there's obvious contingencies. You could have some sort of uprising in Turkey or more dissension. They could overextend themselves. I mean, they're all the way out in Western Mediterranean now, west of Italy, down in Libya. But I think the most likely thing you're going to see is if there is a collapse in Iraq or a significant rise in ISIS activity in Iraq, you may actually see a major Turkish intervention into Iraq. And I don't know if they're going to, I mean, the Kurds are up there in the Kurdistan region, and Turkey's been intervening in small cases to attack the Kurdish terrorist groups. There's a Kurdistan Patriotic Front, the KPF, and then the KPP is the Kurdish People's Party. It's very confusing, but there's a Kurdish government, and then there are Kurdish terrorist fighters on that territory. Turkey has been attacking them, but I'm saying you may see Turkey take a slice out of Iraq if there is a general collapse. They may initiate or be the biggest beneficiary of a partition. That's a little bit unlikely, but it's not out of the cards. So definitely the forecast for 2021 is Turkey continues to strengthen its regional hegemony. Just checking in with folks. People are going to play Stellaris. Mike is a big fan of Stellaris. If you need any Stellaris advice, cheat codes, Mike's got you covered. Some Game of Thrones binging with the better half. Don't let anyone sell you short. Game of Thrones is the best series of this century so far. I said it. That's my InfoMullet. Mike, good to see you. Happy New Year from the Triad. Welcome. Let's see. So let's go back to a little bit of fun here. what was the best worst forecast from last year? So in 2020, I hinted at this at the beginning. We're going through, this is kind of a little sidebar. What was the best worst forecast in 2020? Well, in 2020, the New Year's Eve Ask Me Anything, question 14 said, beyond 2020, what concerns interest you the most? You know, what keeps you up at night? What makes you worried in the next 10 years? And I think they were imagining me to say climate change. Climate change wasn't even on the list. The number one thing that concerned me was antibacterial resistant bacteria and antiviral resistant viruses or new viruses. Boom, done. Number two, the dissolution of the international order based on a variety of factors. But because of the rise of populism and because of COVID-19, boom, number two done. We no longer have any international order. Travel stopped, agreements are off. And number three, the return of regional hegemons. Boom, trifecta. I got all three. This is the best/worst forecast of 2020. I hope I don't have one like that's this bad again, because that would be unfortunate. I may, but we'll see for next year. So that was the best/worst forecast of 2021. Let's see here. Quick, here we go. All right, moving into some domestic issues. This one's going to be controversial, maybe. Question number 5, how does former President Trump fare in 2021? I am saying right now that I don't think President Trump's going to be alive by the end of 2021. It's controversial, I know. It's a bold forecast. I'm probably going to end up regretting it. But everyone's worried about what Trump's going to do and what's going to happen. I'm saying the guy's not going to live past 2021. He's not going to make it. It's not that there's an assassination or anything like that. Don't get it twisted. What it is, though, is that, you know, look, this guy has lived off this almost addiction-like daily center of attention for 4 years. I mean, first of all, take Trump out of the equation. Look at any picture of a U.S. president from the start of their first term to the end of their first term. They don't look so hot. They don't do so well after the stress of this job. It's a very stressful job. Now look at President Trump, who lives on attention, he thrives on attention, and he has managed to be the most talked about thing, bar none, for the entire 4 years in office. Not just overall, but literally like every day he's out there doing stuff. And I sense that this is going to be like when he loses power, the letdown from that is going to be very similar to when somebody has a spouse that passes and they're old, they're in their senior years, you know, they're in their 80s or their late 70s, and they have a spouse that they have, and they just don't have that support anymore, and they go 6 months later. I think Trump is going to be under tremendous strains as the reality of that he is no longer numero uno begins to settle in. And that's, of course, a very controversial plan. So what's a contingency to Trump dying by the end of 2021? Well, the obvious contingency is he doesn't die. So what happens then? Let's go through some of those scenarios and just do some contingency scenarios. First of all, there's a lot of question, is he going to run a TV network, have Trump News or anything like that? I don't think it's capable. News networks are very complex, sophisticated operations logistically to run. Forget the opinions they put out, just the aspects of coordinating live video and all the scheduling and all the technical things. You need competent management. I don't think Trump has the ability to do that. He's always thrived where he can have small, highly loyal, almost family-based folks in areas where the competent management matters less than your ability to sort of rig the set. I don't think he's going to run a TV network, but maybe he's going to be an opinion commentator on a TV network. OAN, Fox News, though less likely now that they pissed him off. You know, Parler, maybe he's going to be an opinionator, right? Get his own show, do Sean Hannity. Here's the thing. As president, Trump has enjoyed the enormous privilege of being virtually immune from any sort of liability for what he or his supporters are saying. However, since the election, there is this movement called the red slime lawsuits. And this is a major development that I think is going to show why Trump is not going to be as successful a force, at least in shaping opinion through these platforms. And what the red slime lawsuits did is they're called red slime because of the Oprah defamation lawsuits that were about pink slime. But the red slime lawsuits are going after the Trump supporters who say completely untrue things about the elections, verifiably false things or things that could never be true. And even to the point where they themselves are not putting this in court, but they're making these claims in public about individuals and companies. So Dominion voting systems and the the other one that is doesn't. There's another election company that's based out, got tied up with Venezuela. They don't even have voting machine operations in the U.S., but they were getting attacked for rigging the election, and they're like, hello, we have markets abroad. You're hurting our business. We are suing you for defamation and libel. There's a cost to that, and we can prove we have no operations in the U.S. That is a good lawsuit with a strong chance of winning. This isn't someone, saying, well, this is my opinion. These are people stating facts, and these facts are wrong. So any network that wants to host Trump or Trump supporters are going to deal with this liability. Twitter doesn't have to keep him on their platform when he's no longer president. They may just decide, look, the hassle's not worth it. Boop, you're gone. All of these things he's gained from privilege of being the president and the immunity that comes with it go away. So I don't think, he may tone it down, but that kind of, that's the only thing I can see the opinion. And the other thing is, if he doesn't die, he's going to be spending a lot of his time with federal and state lawsuits. There's obviously New York has a state level lawsuit. The federal lawsuits, there's been a lot of back and forth. We're just now getting the court cases that release some of the materials that the White House has been unwilling to release. Well, the protection that is held ends when President Biden gets inaugurated. Unless they got a shredding machine going, and I don't think they do, a lot of the information that is needed to at least charge these cases, if people want to take it, is going to be found and released in the first year or second year under the existing subpoenas that are out there. Biden can say, hey, there's an existing subpoena from the House. Go ahead and answer that. And he can direct the Department of Justice, no longer defend that case. And so a lot of these lawsuits are going to go forward. Remember, the only things we know about now are from people who are willing to whistleblow and lose their careers over saying what happened in Trump. Once Trump's gone, he can't affect your career. And I bet there's going to be a lot more stuff coming out. So now let's say that all of this, he survives. The big test for Trump's, everyone's worried about 2024. Focus on the midterms. If I'm wrong, the way you'll know I'm wrong is in the primaries for the 2020 midterms. That's going to be January, February, March of 2022. So it's still over a year out. But if Trump is able to influence who wins the primaries in the Republican election by the midterms in 22, he is still a force to be reckoned with. He still has to be taken seriously. I don't think it's going to happen. But that's my forecast, generating a little controversy for your New Year's Eve, being provocative. Let's see, go back to some questions. Lots of good conversation between folks, not going to chat at all. Someone saying, yeah, 2020 New Year's Eve, Q14, there are not 14 quarters. 2020, you may not know this, but from a space-time continuum standpoint, each month in 2020 was like a dog month. It was actually 7 months in real time. That's why it feels so long. Yeah, Valeria saying, see, Humber Guy, War on Christmas for the litigation limits on right-wing cranks as entertainment. What will happen to the extremely Christian part of his base? Valeria, they're doing a good job right now of going out and getting infected. So I don't think it will be enough, but they're putting themselves in harm's way. I think the Trump base probably stays with Trump, or at least the momentum that he has stays. But without Trump, the big question is, can Trumpism survive without Trump? And can Trumpism survive without Trump being bombastic? If he dies or somehow muzzled or goes away, I don't know. It doesn't mean that they're not going to be conservative. I think they're going to stay, but it will be, this is where all these tests, this litmus test, watch the 2022 midterm primaries. That's where we see. Laura's saying, I think they'll move on to the next personality and conspiracy theory. Very possible, Laura, but what's going to happen is it's going to fracture. I don't think any other personality can basically be the heir apparent unless it's one of his children and there's like a handoff or whatever you do when you're the Pope or the king and you designate your heir. I don't think there's any one person who can grab the Trump movement and claim it on their own, which means it fractures. And division, conquest by division is an age-old tactic. The more they fragment, you're seeing it now. The biggest fights since probably December 8th, let's call it the safe harbor deadline. By the way, 2020 rhyme of the year, remember the 8th of December, safe harbor deadline to stop. Evidence invented with lawsuits prevented. Yeah, lawsuits prevented with evidence invented, 55 lawsuits Trump's lost. It needs some work. But no, since December 8th, the safe harbor, most of the fighting in the Trump space has been within the Trump and the Republican Party. There's a vicious fight going on right now in Georgia where literally they are going to lose the Senate races because Trump supporters are so mad at Republicans for made up stuff. So they may continue. The question is, are they going to be effective at countering the Democratic Party? Now, in fairness, the Democratic Party has never been known as strong unity, good cohesion, esprit de corps. We won, now let's all work together in happy unity and harmony. No, they're going to go after each other as well, so you may see some of that. But what are my thoughts on the Lincoln Project in conjunction with the Republican Party? Good question, Lisa. In relation to Trump, the Lincoln Project is really focused on Trump, and they're going to have a hard time redefining themselves as being something other than anti-Trump for Republicans. There's still not a lot of Republicans who have bucked Trump, but we're seeing more and more. Romney has been one consistent critic since the impeachment. You've seen a bunch of other ones that are sort of on their way out the door. They're retiring. They say, oh, this is bad, but I'm gone, so good luck. It's interesting right now. There's a real test as who is more strength in the current configuration, Mitch McConnell or Trump. Trump wants $2,000 stimulus checks, and he wants the DOD bill passed. McConnell has stopped the $2,000 in the Senate, and that means he stopped Trump. I don't know how that plays out, but the Lincoln Project is going to have to redefine itself either to save the Republican Party for itself. And again, the litmus test for this, if you want to see if the Lincoln Project remains any momentum as being something other than anti-Trump, watch what they do in the 2022 primaries. Are they a kingmaker for anti-Trump Republicans, the restore the party, take us back from the brink, Romney wing, whatever? Yep. So let's keep going here. All right. Next question. Back to international. Will North Korea get question 6? Will North Korea get more involved in the world stage in 2021, specifically in regards to Russia and Japan? So we've actually not heard much from North Korea. It's been a quiet. They got a lot of attention in their first half of Trump's administration. There was a lot of talk of diplomacy. They were doing the bro hug. They were getting together, having little chats and walks. It was like one of those Tinder profiles. But that's all done now, and they haven't talked to each other since 2018. So one reason we're not hurting is North Korea is really hurting from COVID-19. They've never been doing well in terms of government-induced famine, inability to produce enough material goods to serve their own people, simple getting fuel. And what they've done for years is parlay military threats into negotiated deals. And again, this is a diplomatic question. It's complex. I've been very anti-North Korea, and since 2008, I thought we need to handle North Korea. But the diplomats have continued buying off with things, and there hasn't been an issue. But I continue to think that we're entering the risk period, continuing ratcheting up to a point. So first of all, to the forecast. North Korea is not going to be able to do anything in regards to Russia and Japan in 2021. They are hurting so bad right now that they have literally only one card to play. But it's a big card. And so watch for this in 2021. In October, North Korea had a parade, and it was the first parade with ballistic missiles since 2018. They kind of canceled the parades and make Trump happy. Now they did the parades again. It not only debuted the Hwasong-15, that's an ICBM they've tested. That ICBM can reach the United States. Not much. There's certain parts. It's at the end of its arc. They also displayed a new what's called Super Monster ICBM. This thing can carry a 2,000 to 3,000 kilogram warhead by the experts are looking at it. And this thing, if they're anticipating this Super Monster ICBM can reach anywhere in the continental United States and carry a nuclear weapon. So this is the big card they have to play. Now, a huge question, it was just a prop, it was something on a vehicle and you're not there. You can't open it up and see. They don't know if this was a mock-up. They don't know if this was a working prototype. This would be, whenever you see these new ICBMs, what you're looking for is, do they test it to prove its operational efficacy? The Hwasong-15 has been tested several times. And beginning in 2017, I said, look, we're at the brink. If North Korea does 4 to 6 more ICBM tests, they're going to have proven capability to deliver an ICBM in the US, and at that point, we have to strike. My forecast for 2021 is that they're going to do at least 1 to 2 of those 4 to 6 ballistic tests. And if they are successful tests, either of the Hwasong 15 or especially this new one, you're going to have a situation where China, the United States, and Russia, as the three nuclear power capabilities, are going to say, do we trust the government structure and the transition of powers to control nuclear armed weapons that can hit any one of our countries from North Korea? And that's a real crisis scenario. Now, they may decide to go in and provide lots of bribes and support to keep that from happening. There may be the kind of strike that I've advocated for, which is it's too much to get into tonight. There's a couple articles on the InfoMullet, but it's basically a negotiated agreement between Russia, China, and US with some real politic to basically take North Korea out of this capability and then move in and, kind of the elements of it is you can't go into North Korea without getting China's agreement. The only reason China would agree is if you agreed to have the US leave South Korea afterwards and let South Korea and North Korea deal with the reunification. And therefore, China would get the US out of South Korea. The US would get a diminishment of North Korea's threat off the table. Some grand deal like that. Probably not very likely. But I think the real risk is that this super monster ICBM, if it's not just a mock-up done for display purposes, my forecast is 1 to 2 ballistic missiles tests. And if they test this one, watch for a sudden ratchet up in North Korea tensions, because that's an ICBM that, if it tests successfully, can hit anywhere in the United States, which means it can hit most of Canada, and it can deliver a nuclear weapon. Now, contingency is North Korea is doing so bad, they may simply collapse altogether. North Korea has always prioritized government and military construction projects. They prioritize food and fuel. They're not even able to do that anymore. Forests are reclaiming large amounts of land. They can't be farmed. There's no fuel for the tractors. The government priority projects, they're stalled, they're delayed, they're not being finished. There's a lot of signs that the economic woe of North Korea is catching up to it, to the point where they couldn't even finish and do these tests because there's a lot of money spent into that. But that's the forecast for 2021. Yep. Yeah. People are saying the leader dies. I'm not going to do a forecast on it, but if you ever hear anything about South or North Korea and you want a credible source, the two ones I read for North Korea, if you need it, is 38th Parallel. It's a blog that is intensely focused on North Korea, very accurate, very technical, and releases by the South Korean military, the ROK. Now, the South Korean politicians, they may say this, that, or the other. Someone wants to run in a microphone and say something. But the South Korea military and the intelligence services, when they release something, that tends to be credible on what's going on inside for North Korea. Mike's asking, do you think North Korea will have any cooperation with Russia to cause friction with Japan now that Russia is grabbing more islands to secure the lanes to the Arctic? Russia's in trouble. I don't think Russia has much to offer. Russia's influence has waned in North Korea. In fact, they even came out, if you look a couple weeks ago, Mike, there was North Korea said, hey, we got a vaccine from Russia. We bought it. And Russia said, no, you didn't. And it was really kind of a repudiation. I don't think Russia has much of a plan anymore. Russia is much more concerned about their internal stability, avoiding their own collapse of the elites that we saw that led to the collapse of the Soviet Union, and dealing with Turkey. I don't think Russia has much appetite for something as far-flung as getting involved in North Korea and doing something with Japan. And they haven't shown well until now. Japan isn't necessarily a military threat to Russia, and it's very good that you're talking about these Arctic lanes, because that is something that's going to happen. But Canada's up in there, the US is up in there, Japan's got some plays up there, Russia obviously wants to be in there, but it's going to be hard for Russia to play in all of these spots as a global power when they're really struggling internally. So that's my take on that one aspect of the question. All right, let's go to question 7, and then I may take a short intermission here, but let's do question 7. Will Al-Qaeda or ISIS be stronger in personnel influence by the end of 2021? This is something I get asked every year. It's a valid point. These are the two largest worldwide global terrorist networks in operation, and so it's an important thing to talk about. So there we go. Let's get up here. So yeah, my forecast for 2021 is both Al-Qaeda and ISIS get stronger. So my forecast for 2020 was that ISIS gets stronger. 2021 is Al-Qaeda and ISIS get stronger. And the reasons for this are several. You kind of do a map of the world, right? In the Sahel, the South Saharan region that I've talked about, Western Africa, both Al-Qaeda and ISIS are just running rampant over there. They are recruiting, they're active, there are insurgencies. There may even be an emerging state actor scenario there. France has an ongoing intervention in Mali. It's kind of not working so hot. You got Nigeria, Niger, all these activities. They have local groups. That continues to be an area that's going to be active for Al-Qaeda and ISIS. ISIS has also shown recently its ability to expand in Mozambique. They're still very potent in Somalia, as is Al-Qaeda. But the big factors are going to drive this propulsion is first for Al-Qaeda. The U.S. is scheduled to cut the peace deal with the Taliban and remove the U.S. troops here in a matter of months. And there's a little bit of contention between President Trump. He wants to remove them by January 15th. That's going to be a question of whether that happens or not. But the U.S. president is drawing down. There is no indication the Taliban is honoring its agreement to kick the Al-Qaeda out of its country. Because remember, the Taliban, the Taliban influence network is not just in Afghanistan, but extends partway into Pakistan in the Waziristan province, that sort of federally affiliated tribal areas, FATA, in the northwestern part of Pakistan, eastern part of Afghanistan. So the Taliban has a lot of Al-Qaeda sympathizers, areas like that. And as the Taliban continues to take power in Afghanistan, they're taking districts. They're doing it a very slow, methodical, but they are taking territory. They're holding territory, and they're gobbling it up. That gives Al-Qaeda the room to grow back and reconstitute. It's the same thing we saw, unfortunately, going back into the 90s. And although there is an ISIS province there, ISIS in the Khorasan province, the Wilayat ISIS-K, they haven't been very effective at attracting enough talent to be a significant enough threat to either the Taliban or Al-Qaeda or the Haqqani network to be much of a player. So I see, as the U.S. withdraws from Afghanistan, the Taliban, the Haqqani, and Al-Qaeda will be beneficiaries. That gives Al-Qaeda to give a place they can base out of with some security, as well as all these little regional affiliates. We mentioned Iraq. ISIS had began insurgent activities in Iraq probably September, October. They did rocket attacks on a few airports. They're now beginning to own the night, as it were. That means if you have these outlying villages or rural areas around the desert in the Sunni, the Sunni Triangle in the Anbar province, that means that, yes, the state has nominal control during the day, but at night, you don't go out at night. The insurgents have control. We're seeing that happen. There's a real possibility of Iraq collapsing in 2021. And if they do, ISIS will benefit. I've talked about the partition of Iraq. There's so much going on. There's complete instability from a population doesn't trust the government doesn't trust the population. You have PMC militia groups running around that are Iranian backed, but not really in control anymore since Soleimani was killed. You have ISIS is rearing itself again. You have PKK terrorists. All of these things are just this complete chaos in Iraq. It's a non-trivial chance that if Iraq collapses or has a partial collapse, ISIS will rise up and take a position of that. Turkey may move in, take a slice of partition. Iran may move and take a partition of Iraq. We may see a partition of Iraq, but that's where I think the most growth for ISIS will be, is in the Iraq area, because they're able to make the claim, the grievances, the same one that they came before. If you're a Arab Sunni, the Arab Shias are out to get you. Look at these PMCs. They're running around. They're running amok. The government's killing you in the streets. We can protect you. There's a little bit of savvy here. People have seen this ISIS routine before, and they're kind of like, hey, I remember you guys. You had murder squares. No, thank you. Going to pass on that. But with insurgencies, you never know. So that's where I see in Q7 coming up. So I notice we're at the hour and we're about halfway through. So what I want to do now is actually take a short intermission so I can take a quick break and hit the restroom and all that. You can take a quick break. You can top off your drink. What comes next after this are going to be the COVID forecasts. If you've been waiting for what happens with COVID in 2021, that comes up next. So let me go ahead and make sure that I'm not broadcasting my bathroom break live, and then there we go. All right, we're back. We're finally tuned NASCAR pit team over here. We do it. So, first of all, thank you everyone for joining us for New Year's Eve. If you're tuning in, this is our third annual New Year's Eve Ask Me Anything, where you submit forecasts for the horrible things that are going to happen in 2021, and I tell you, yes, they are going to happen, or no, they're not. And if I'm wrong, I give you a contingency of how I'd be wrong. I'll follow up with blog posts on this on the blog as why I'm doing this. I'm kind of making it up as I go, but I tend to backfill some good reasons. And then at the end of 2021, we check to see how I did. So far, after 2 years, I'm a solid 87.5% accuracy in a completely made up measure that I myself am the only judge of. So also, we're doing something a little fun. It's New Year's Eve. Share hellos with one another. Share what you're doing New Year's Eve. Also, this is a time for made up awards. Give yourself some end of year awards, hand them out to other muleteers, give them to yourself. You want to give Bonky something, that's fine. Let me go through here. Good to see people. Sinead, good to see you. Jeremy, good to see you. Also, charge your drinks. Make sure you have something liquid here. I'd say drink responsibly tonight, but you're all home, so get blitzed, whatever. You're going to need it because we're about to go into the COVID-19 forecast, and I hate to say it, you're going to want some drinks handy after this. So let's get started with the COVID-19 forecast, which make up the last part of this. All right. So do you have your drinks ready? Great. Question 8. In 2021, will the United States reach herd immunity through vaccination? I put this after the intermission, and I put this because every forecast after that is contingent upon this answer. This is the forecast that I think is the big one to go through. So if everyone wants to do a virtual drum roll, the answer is no. We will not reach herd immunity through vaccination in 2021, and I'm really sorry to have to tell you that, but I don't see how it happens. So a couple numbers just to keep in mind of sort of how I'm spitballing this, right? We have 330 million people in the US, and depending on who you talk to, an optimistic herd immunity vaccination rate is 50% of that population. A cynical or more realistic is about 80%. So you're talking the ability to vaccinate 165 million to 264 million people to get herd immunity. Current vaccine distributions so far this month in December are 2.5 million. Now, to be fair, we're starting out. This is the first month, right? Let's assume that number quadruples through a normal progress curve. It quadruples, and in 3 months, we're doing 10 million a month, right? That would still take it 10 million a month, 16 to 26 months to reach herd immunity. Even if we hit 20 million a month, which is a 10 times increase of what we're doing now, that's August in the optimistic point, herd immunity of where we only need 50%, and that's December in the worst case. So, and why is this, right? So there's a phrase, amateurs talk strategy, professionals talk logistics. I have talked about the strategic risk of pandemics, and that the only strategy that works is vaccination. The strategic risk is the virus mutates before you get vaccination. But that's the strategy, right? Congratulations, we now have the vaccine. We know what our strategy is. The hard part is executing it. And people are always underestimating how complex supply chains are to put in place, manage, and do it. If you were to distribute sticky notes to 160, let's put it this way, if you were to distribute pizza, which most people like pizza, to 160 million people, even with the pizza chains, that would be hard because you got to track who got it, who didn't, whether they got what they wanted, stuff like that. Now you're talking about something that has to be stored at a specific temperature. You've got to do 2 doses that are 21 days apart, which means there's a scheduling after. And we have not put in place any infrastructure of, this is the stuff we should have been planning in probably as early as no later than June, July, in normal government planning. I'm talking for normal government planning. We planned the Iraq invasion for 1.5 years before we did it, right? You plan these things out in advance, and there has been very little federal planning on how the states are to set this up. So I don't think we're going to have the kind of multiplier and the pace of distribution. I do think the vaccines work. I trust the science. I do think that we have a shot, but the problem is the logistic picture does not give me confidence that we're going to reach herd immunity in 2021, and I see people crying. I'm sorry to be the bearer of bad news. I'd love to be surprised here, right? Mentally, do what you need to prepare for another year of the pandemic conditions like we're seeing now with waves and things like that. And the challenge is going to be that it's not just the future waves. They may not be as high, but you start talking about a condition for anyone who's involved in the U.S. military, especially the U.S. Army, from about 2003 to 2010. They know that fighting two wars put an unsustainable strain on the U.S. Army. And we're seeing the unsustainable strain on our healthcare. So right now, everyone's talking about collapse as a factor of capacity and staffing. Southern California is at maximum. They've filled up all the ICUs. They don't even have any hospital room left. They don't have the staff. You're seeing this in more and more areas. Say we get past that. Even if later waves are lesser, that doesn't mean the risk is lesser, because we're going to start to see fatigue collapse, people leaving the field, delayed infrastructure falling apart. Just the systems cannot be put under this strain without support for this long. And so there's a real risk in the middle of 2021, we're going to continue to see bad waves, because they may be lesser, but the infrastructure that we're relying on now, we're not restoring it. If you've ever been in the military, it's not that you just fight. It's you prepare, you stockpile, you fight a little bit, and then you sustain, you restore, you recover, and you get it ready for the next time. There has been no break to do those activities, and even if they were, we don't have the organization. So I am forecasting that this pandemic keeps a major pain in our ass through 2021. Now, the only silver lining, the good news in this that I think, is the unknown innovations, right? When this started, a lot of people are like, oh, it'll be over in June. Wave one will come and go. It'll be over. Let's not invest in anything. But as the longer this has gone on, more and more innovators and people like that are investing in things. And I'm not talking vaccines here now. I'm talking about invisible innovations that reduce that fatigue and strain that are specifically COVID-19 related. They're going to start coming onto the market. They may be bought up by the US, the government. They may be bought up by hospitals. They're designed to make doing the work of managing COVID-19 easier. I don't know what those are going to be. The innovation curve is always hard to predict. It's impossible to say which one, but I bet we're going to start seeing some time-saving, better mitigation strategies, things that help workers, help hospitals, help healthcare workers. These things are going to start coming, because the new reality is we're still living with this, and therefore there's still a need, and these investments that were made early are going to start coming to market, and that may help a little bit. Obviously, a contingency that I'm wrong, which I hope I am, is a significant increase in the distribution of vaccines, but early signs do not look good. The CDC tracks this. We're at 2.5 million. As always, the CDC is about 8 weeks lag, so that may go up. But we're already seeing opinion polls of like up to 50% of healthcare workers aren't willing to take the vaccine in some of these surveys in California. That's not a good sign for uptick and buy-in, and we have to overcome this huge political wrangle, but there's also the logistics part. So again, I'd love to have a contingency that we had. Everyone's like, hey, yeah, this wave was so bad. We saw these people die. Let's go and start doing this seriously. But I'm saying through 2021, we're still living with the pandemic. We do not reach herd immunity in 2021. So let's see. Next question. Again, get your drinks out. Well, okay, a little bit of, let's see here. Internationally, what's the biggest change you see from, here we go. Question number 9. Internationally, what's the biggest change for the pandemic we're missing right now that'll become clear in 2021? Well, the first one is it's not going to end. So everyone's like, yay, back to normal. No, that's not going to happen. But it's a good question. Like, as this goes on, the concept of returning to normal increasingly becomes unrealistic, right? The world changes, and it changes in ways that it's not just going to flip a switch and go back to what we remember. And this is the hard part. There's dealing with it now, but understanding that some things will remain permanently changed. And from an international standpoint, the things that we're missing right now is the supply chain disruptions I've talked about. The international order and the free trade supply was predicated on the U.S. being a central consumer and chief orchestrator of a lot of the supply chains as a destination and as a purchaser. as the US struggles with COVID and other countries do better, they're already organizing themselves outside of us. Germany's already organized something in Eastern Europe. Asia and Canada are organizing something in the Pacific with Canada, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, all those. These regional supply chains, they're not going to be switched back just because COVID ended, right? These are real disruptions. There's also the question of control, containment, and eradication. New Zealand talks about we've eradicated the virus or we've contained it. These things, control is when you can manage the curve. You still have the pandemic going on, but you're managing it. Your fatality rate goes down. Containment is where you've really begun to isolate it and you have good testing. You really know where it all is and what's going on. And eradication is when there's no more cases. In a globally connected marketplace, you don't get to say we've eradicated COVID anywhere until we've eradicated COVID everywhere. And I'm not saying like in some little tiny remote place there might be one or two. I'm just saying until Europe, Asia, the main companies, take the OECD 20 as just a litmus test. Until every country on that list eradicates it, it's not eradicated anywhere because the travel between these countries is always the risk of reinfection. And that's the problem with this haphazard international response of pockets. Everyone's focused on their own thing and they're missing the big picture that let's say we get our act together and we start doing stuff. Until it's eradicated anywhere, it's not eradicated everywhere. And that's going to be the big thing. In addition to this, the big things we're missing because of this, I've mentioned the rise of Turkey as regional hegemon. It is here and it is now. Corresponding to that is the fall of Russia as a regional power. They may still threaten Europe as a very close state, and they don't have to worry about Turkey in Northern Europe. But Russia has really been knocked back on its heels because of COVID and because of Turkey. And this Arab-Israeli reordering that I mentioned earlier, possibly against Iran, possibly against Turkey, these are things that are going to happen that are not directly related to the pandemic, but are happening in the shadow of the pandemic because Turkey is relatively managing COVID-19 better than its near peers and has demonstrated the capabilities I discussed earlier. See if there's any question. Marissa's saying, my coworkers have already developed a research-grade material that is SARS-CoV-2 mRNA, so scientists can calibrate their instruments. They see that's the innovation I'm talking about. I have no idea half the words you just said, and certainly not in any combination of sentences what they mean, but that's the kind of innovation I'm talking about. Some little device or something which is only known by the specialist, but it gives us a little bit of an edge that makes testing easier, it makes processing things easier, it means that nurses need to spend less time and therefore can get more rest. It makes anything, something that makes daycare easier. All these innovations in their own little fields, that will help mitigate the problem as the world adjusts and begin reacting. Humans never stay down on their heels for long. We're always reacting, we're always innovating and adapting. But that's part of the reason I think we're not going back to normal is we are adapting, and we're adapting in ways that I think are going to be sticky even after the COVID-19 pandemic in 2022 hopefully gets resolved. So, all right, next question, number 10, similar version for the US. Within the US, what's the biggest change of the pandemic we're missing right now that will appear in 2021? We just went over the international, now we're gonna go over the US. And again, this is all contingent on my forecast that we don't reach herd immunity in 2021. The great change that is being missed is what I call the leveling of location, the great leveling of location. In the US, despite the internet, despite telework, despite remote work, there have been haves and have-nots on cities based on location-based network effects that were during the internet booms in the 90s. This is when the trend really started. Certain have cities, usually on the coast, they had nice areas, good environments. You're talking San Francisco, Seattle, Boston. They became the winners of this network effect of the more capital came in, they attracted a lot of talent, therefore there's a lot of talent to start new startups, therefore more capital came in. This shifted in the last 10 years. You saw this begin to move and grow in south and southwest areas and southeast areas, Atlanta network effects, Austin network effects in Texas. You're seeing these regional hubs of location-based clustering. Alongside that has come a lot of the ills that we don't directly relate to work location, cost of living, real estate prices, wage inequity, average wage and rental prices. These are all tied together. And what the leveling of location means is as more and more companies decide they're not going to base their headquarters or they're not going to require their workforce to be on site in a specific area and they adopt workforce, that has a tremendous cascade effect that may undo these accumulations that have been building for 20 years. I mean, imagine a scenario where a lot of companies in San Francisco say, hey, high-paid tech workers, you no longer have to live here, and they just disperse over California and the rest of the United States. First of all, a lot of people be like, no Californians, but let's forget the politics, right? The economic impact of that would be devastating to California, absolutely devastating, and especially San Francisco. You're talking about a collapse, but it would benefit every other area, and it would begin to level out some of these things, that the cost of living in San Francisco is so much higher than just about anywhere else. And in these cities where these network effects, that's where the drivers of your inequality, these are inequality machines. So the leveling of locations is a sort of a neutral force. It has, just like the network effect had winners and losers, the leveling of location will have winners and losers. Those areas where remote workforces move to, they have lower cost of living, they're going to benefit, they're going to get better economics. We might see things like less commuting, less carbon. These are all good things. You might see real estate after a bit of disruption begin to decline in these areas that are like high real estate now. That'll help new buyers on the market. It won't help current owners that are under these really expensive mortgages. So the downside, you might see foreclosures go up. You might see that. Personal habits, there's a lot of personal habits that are changing, not just the way it works, but how much do I go out and spend on eating and consumption and things like that, that when we stay in, we realize, wow, I was spending a lot of money on things I didn't need to spend on. As that change and becomes a habit-forming device that we don't go back to, that's going to be a leveling out effect on the economy. And we don't know where this is going to go. But the fact that this didn't end in June, it didn't end in September, it's certainly not ending in December, and I don't think it's going to end for 2021, means that the impetus for this leveling effect becomes stronger and stronger. If this had been a 3-month thing, no one's going to relocate their company or make their workforce remote over just 3 months. They may do it for a period of time and then come back. But as this becomes the new normal and we continue to struggle with this, I think that's the biggest change to watch for in 2021. And you're going to see it in real estate prices and inventories. If inventories begin dropping, if inventories increase, there's a threshold effect in real estate inventory. At 6 months and above, you've got a collapse coming. You've got too much inventory, properties aren't moving, the prices are too high. That was a leading indicator that helped me call the housing collapse in the 2007, 8, 9 recession. I was able to call the housing collapse looking solely at housing inventory. Real estate prices lag inventory, so you could watch those. Now, right now, real estate prices are good. They continue to go up, so it's not showing yet. But watch the inventory in these coastal areas. And if inventory starts to creep to 4 months, 5 months, 6 months, 7 months, that may be an early indication. You might also see some marquee headlines of this company moves out of this city. I've seen one of those recently where a company moved out of California to Texas. You may see those announcements, but a lot of this stuff is going to happen off the major radars. It's going to be second-tier companies that aren't the name brand ones, but are also distributing their folks. And that's how you're going to know that this leveling effect is underway. So let's see here. Next question. Let's see if there's any questions out there as I recalibrate myself. By the way, thank you everyone for joining. If you haven't, check us out on Patreon, www.patreon.com/InfoMullet. All this video will be uploaded tomorrow on our YouTube. The YouTube channel is YouTube, just do YouTube InfoMullet, you'll find it. And then we'll break these segments up for the forecast and get them uploaded the week after Friday. I appreciate everyone hanging out for New Year's Eve tonight. You have a lot of choices within a very small aperture, so you have choices. I appreciate your spending it with me. Thank you. Hope you're drinking something heavy. I'd say drink responsibly, but if you're home, fuck it, drink what you want. Have fun. Let's see here. Next question is, the longest running correct forecast. Let's do this. This is another fun one. We could use a little humor. These are the longest running correct forecasts I've made. So in 2019, I was asked 2 questions that continue to be true. The first one was, will org LARPing remain a mess? The answer is yes, it continues. Part of that's COVID related. For those of you who are gamers, this is kind of a chuckle one because the joke is LARP.org is always a mess, but COVID has definitely hit organized LARPing very heavily. It's caused a lot of impacts, and a lot of clubs are grappling to deal with, and with the inability to play games. That's the main thing that people tend to go for. They're not using the time necessary to reconcile and rationalize and fix things. They're just trying to figure out how to play games. They can't play games. It's struggling. Some organizations are doing well, but a lot are hurting. So that's a continuous one. The very next question is, will Brexit remain a mess? Yes, Brexit is still a mess. They've got the agreement. They've avoided the hard Brexit, but only by a little time. And as I mentioned with logistics, it takes a lot of planning. We can make these policy decisions and say, yeah, they signed a treaty with 5 days to go, but putting that in place and getting the kinds of implementation you need for Brexit in this fast, it's going to still be a mess. So we're looking for 6 months of Brexit mess. But if you're wondering which one stays a mess for longer, I think Brexit recovers faster than LARPing. So there you go. Little sidebar. All right. Next question comes from one of our muleteers. Will any state be functionally bankrupt, or bankruptcy if you're using grammar wrong, in 2021? If so, which ones? What does that mean? So the question here is, there's obviously the hardship of the pandemic. There's the economic woes. As the pandemic continues, states are in a bad spot. Will we see states go bankrupt or functionally bankrupt in 2021? And the first thing to know is that states cannot go bankrupt technically. That's why I put the term functionally bankrupt. The original question was bankruptcy. States cannot file for bankruptcy. It's not allowed. Cities can file for bankruptcy, municipalities, some counties, and local governments can file for bankruptcy, but states cannot. So what is a functional bankruptcy? A functional bankruptcy occurs when you're insolvent to the ability that you can't pay your required bills. And that is a scenario with the state. States are required by federal law to pay out their unemployment benefits. They don't have the money to pay it out. They can't pay it. That's a functional bankruptcy. Inability to pay pension payments, right? Legal obligations to pay pension payments. That's a functional bankruptcy. And what's going on is there's been this tremendous multi-pronged hit against the states, and it's been severalfold. Obviously, COVID-19 has caused economic harm because things are shut down, or even if things are open, less people are out going around because they're worried about it. That hurts the economy. It reduces sales tax revenue and income tax revenue. As people lose jobs, they don't pay income taxes. But also, states are having to backfill a lot of healthcare provisions and responding to the emergencies of the crisis. They're having to pay an enormous amount of unemployment benefits. We are still in record territory for unemployment. I think we're having something like 800,000 people a week are going on unemployment, and that they stay on unemployment for a while because it's a tough area. This is all things that happened in 2020, but already before 2020, the demographic participation rate was declining as the boomers age out of the workforce. So if you think about macroeconomic effects, the generational cohorts, the boomer is a huge cohort. You want lots of people working in the prime of their career where they're earning the most, spending the most, and being taxed the most. As boomers retire and they begin saving that money, they sell their houses, they're no longer working, their income tax goes down, the labor participation rate declines because boomers are much bigger than Gen X. Millennials are bigger than Gen X, and Zillennials are so basically it's an odd, even. Boomers and millennials are the two big cohorts. Gen X and Zillennials are the two smaller cohorts. So the Gen X cannot make up the prime earning capacity of the boomer. So that was a demographic thing before COVID happened. Now COVID on top of that has exacerbated that labor participation rate, driving it down close to 60%. We're normally at 65. Structurally, we should be at 63. We're around 60. That's huge. Taking what I just talked about, the great leveling. If California loses a bunch of this high earning workforces where people kind of well, these companies don't pay taxes. Yes, but the people they employ do. And the income taxes a state can earn on a company like Facebook or Amazon are enormous because those salaries are earned in that state. You may not, taxing the corporation is one thing, but definitely if those companies start allowing their workers to go to other states and you lose that income tax revenue from that workforce, that is a huge revenue loss that may not be easy to make up because it's not like there's going to be a bunch of people making several $100,000 to come in after it necessarily. So what are some of the things that drive this? Underfunded pensions is a huge problem in the States even before COVID-19. A pension funding level that's good is about 80%. There are only about 17 states that have 80% funded or higher pension levels. That means the majority of states are underfunded for their pension. They were thinking that, well, we won't fund it up now. We'll have better times in the future because we'll pay something else now. And these states, this is not a ideological thing. California, Texas, Florida, New York, Illinois, Michigan, all of these states are hurting. The worst ones for funding pensions are like New Jersey, 38% funded. Illinois is 39% funded. Kentucky, Mitch McConnell, hats off, 45% funded. These are states that are hurting with no ideological distinction. Now, again, a state can't go bankrupt. So a functional bankruptcy is when it's unable to make its payments, and then all sorts of things start to have a ripple effect. They got to cut services, hard to do in a pandemic. Emergency services begin getting cut. I don't think my forecast for 2020 is I think the states have enough leg room, and the great leveling, if it occurs, won't be sharp enough that we're going to see a state hit functional bankruptcy in 2021. No functional bankruptcies at the state level in 2021, but we are going to see is at least one major city declare bankruptcy. This happens every couple of years. People tend to get surprised, like, oh, wow, a city can do it? Yes, we will see a major city, million-plus people, at least one, declare bankruptcy in 2021. But watch out during 2021 as conditions continue to erode, or we may see these functional bankruptcies in 2022 as the position of the states become more perilous. Now, this may change. Under a Biden administration, there may be more impetus for the supports for the state, but it doesn't look like there's going to be enough of a margin in the Senate to make a difference. So that's the forecast on states. So next question, for those of you who are interested in universities, we're wrapping it up here, getting to the top. Question 12, will universities be better than today by the end of 2021? My forecast is no, they will not, and it goes back to that question number 8. Because we cannot contain the pandemic and these conditions persist, the things that are hurting universities in devastating ways now will continue to hurt universities in the future. A lot of these forecasts are contingent on that question number 8. If the US can get herd immunity, all this changes, but I don't see that happening in 2021. So now, all these other ripple effects in this ecosystem that are connected to this have to sustain pandemic-like conditions through most of 2021, if not all. So first of all, even before 2020, Moody's had downgraded the financial viability of a bunch of colleges, right? They could absorb at most. Their financial situation was so precarious, which is odd when you think about the tuition they charge, but there's a huge infrastructure and bureaucracy overhead that they have to pay. They predicted, Fitch's, which is one of these rating agencies, said colleges could sustain maybe 5% reduction in annual enrollment. Like that was their buffer. Like, if it's 5%, we'll get through. There's been a 21% enrollment reduction. And that's the first wave of enrollment reductions where people are like, well, maybe I'll be partially online, partially working at home in fall, but it will be better. As this persists through 2021, new cohorts aren't going to come in the freshman class. Existing cohorts are going to begin dropping out, and you may see that enrollment reduction sustain in 2022, and it's going to be harder or 2021. It's going to be harder and harder for universities to absorb that. This means they have to cut out more costs to preserve their credit ratings, which may accelerate the types of problems they have, right? When they get these credit ratings, because they need to get these access to debt to fund themselves, they've got to show solvency. And if they have a drop in revenue, then they're going to have to drop their expenses. And as they drop their expenses, they're losing services that could attract people, and it becomes this vicious cycle, this vicious feedback loop. Now, the other things, the pressures that are going on it, is that people are asking, what are we getting for this payment, right? We're paying all this money, and yet you're teaching us online. This is a self-inflicted wound. Universities had lots of time to experiment with MOOCs and other online things. And I hear all the pedagogists out there say, well, MOOCs aren't really effective and they aren't that good. Well, if you never test, you better get used to testing them and experimenting them, because now you have a situation where you have almost a forced online environment for 2 years. And it's not ideal, but what are you going to do? So by pushing off this kind of, well, it's, as the perfect was the enemy of the good, I think a lot of universities got caught flat-footed, just like Organizations that didn't teach their workforce how to work remotely got hammered and flat-footed when this thing hit. They had to go in a matter of weeks. They had no basis to begin from. A lot of universities the same. They kind of pushed it off, said, we don't have to go online. Look at our facilities. This is a wonderful pool. But they're struggling now. They have to go online, and they aren't able to provide the kind of value that justifies the tuition costs that people are seeing. And tuition in the U.S. is very expensive. The contingency to this forecast, that means universities will do better in 2021, is a bailout from Congress. And this is actually more likely than some of the other scenarios I've talked about, where I'm like, well, there's not enough in the Senate to get it through. University level bailouts has been a consistent, persistent function of the relief bill since the very beginning. And in this last relief bill, there was a lot of funding for COVID-related responses for schools and universities. There was a large multi-$100 billion piece of that's going in there. So there is some appetite for that kind of thing. And these universities, as much as people like to say, well, ideologically, the conservatives don't like universities, they're going to let them die on the vine. Remember, all politics is local, and universities are money makers for the states that they're in, especially these large ones. You may be, ivory tower academics, zombie, but you also know who's bringing in a lot of money and commerce for a lot of these towns where these large colleges are, and you're not going to want to see that just collapse for no reason. So there may be more impetus to do college funding than there is state funding. Of course, these are all connected. If states start to collapse and they cut services, part of what they're going to cut is the funding to public schools and public universities that's going to cause further. So these things are all interrelated. Best forecast I never made. So this is another tangent here, a little bit of humor. I get asked a lot of forecasts that I declined to make. And the best forecast I never made was in 2019. I was asked, who wins the Israel election? And I passed. I said, I got no clue. I'm not doing it. And you know what? I passed on the Israel election of April 2019. I passed on the Israel election of September 2019. I even passed on the Israel election of March 2020. Keep them coming, Israel. You can throw as many elections as you want. I'm going to pass on every single one. I'm not getting involved. Have as many as you want. It's like having a land war in Asia, trying to predict who's going to win that frickin' Israeli election. I'm not getting into it. I'm not doing. You can have as many elections as you want. I'm not going to make a forecast. So that's the best forecast I never made, was avoiding getting involved in Israel politics. Questions here. Look, people. Yeah, people are. So question on the college sports are moneymaker, not always colleges. Yeah, this is a good point. So this is another thing that's hurting universities, is the moneymaker in colleges are the sports, and the sports aren't being attended. So there's lack of attendance. That's another revenue hit. Another question, pedagogist here, MOOCs don't work. Happy to talk that through later. Absolutely, we can talk it through, but what's your choice? I mean, it may not be a MOOC. I use MOOC as a proxy for online. If the pandemic continues through 2021, what's the alternative? You got to find something to do online, or you're putting your people at risk, which I know you know very well. So we'll have that conversation later. Allison's asking, quick question, if you have an opinion, with the recent hacks from Russia, do you see a potential for concern? Yes, I see a potential for concern. Not going to get into it too much because I've got a couple more forecasts to get through, but obviously a national security breach of that level. And this is important to know, that hack did not happen when we found out about it. It had been going on for months by the time we found out about it. So we found out about it, and there's still no reaction. There's still very weak coordinated response. So definitely an area of major concern. Let's see here. Question. All right, question 13. Will there be mass instability or violence like an insurgency or civil war in the US in 2021? What would cause it? I get asked this question a lot. I was asked it last year. Obviously, people were concerned about it. And I want to be clear here. Mass violence is defined as 10,000 deaths or more from a cause like a war or a conflict. So when I say mass instability or violence, I'm not talking, peace attacks here, high murder rates. I'm talking like the things you worry about, you see going on in Afghanistan, you see going on in Syria, you see going on in the US during the 60s, right? During the civil rights movements where there's mass murders, back in the race when the attacks on black communities in the 20s. That's what I mean by mass violence. It's not to say no violence, but specifically mass violence or civil war. I did this, so first of all, there will be clandestine terrorism. One reason I jumped on Nashville, the Christmas morning Nashville, is that was a vehicular-borne improvised explosive device, a VBIED, and it turns out it was a suicide one. That is very concerning because clandestine terrorism is coming to the US, and it's going to probably replace active shooting events as the big thing we all worry about. I don't think it's going to be like, it's not going to be like the Troubles where we have dozens and dozens of bombings on a regular pattern, but it's going to become something that's more prevalent. You may see active shooting events that are ideologically related, more so. Clearly El Paso was ideologically related, but a lot of these ones are other contingencies. But I think you're going to see these clandestine terror events continue and even accelerate in 2021. The conditions are there. But I don't see the conditions being right for civil war and insurgency. Now, last year, I said the window for civil war and insurgency was 2035 to 2045. And really briefly, what that did is that the demographic conditions, which I've gone over before, the physiological barriers, the demographic barrier, the Maslow's hierarchy, those all need to be primed. There needs to be fuel for fire, and those take time to prime. And I said, look, it's going to take time to prime. And then the spark of it, you look at the U.S. Civil War, 41 years it took from the Missouri Compromise to the actual start of the U.S. military war. Now, there was obviously bleeding Kansas and things like that happening before that with mass violence. But what you saw is you begin to see society split. The Baptist and Methodist churches split, the military families split. This leads into civil wars. But why did I think 2035 would be the kickoff? And what's my prediction now? Well, beginning in 2030, you have a structural fiscal collapse in the US. The debt to GDP passes 100% in 2029. Payment on the debts they begin increasing up a larger and larger share of the government. So the ability to pay for things besides interest reduces. And that becomes a problem because the services, the Social Security, by 2032, we can't pay out full benefits anymore, which means we need to inflate what we're doing, inflate the currency, or we pay out less. And all of these begin combining that the fulcrum point was in 2035, we begin having the structural fiscal collapse that reduces services, begins doing it. You've had this ideological stuff going on for 15 years, so those are all primed. That's the window for civil war and insurgency. And I don't think we would have gotten to 2049 without some sort of major pressure. But that was all last year, before the pandemic. The major ripple effect of the pandemic, and my concern from civil war insurgencies, has brought that entire timeline to the left, right? We have begun to see the kind of radicalization and ideological fissions that I get worried about being sustained. Those are in place now. That's what you've begun to see in 2020 with the blue and the red going at it. That doesn't mean that it's a civil war next year. It still takes many years, but this level of hatred and division is the priming fuel that gets people ready to take up those arms and engage in mass violence, not just take up in arms and walk around and protest, but engage in mass violence and instability. So that is, that's in place. Now, it may fade, but it's there. Also, the pandemic brought the Social Security shortfall, which was going to be in 2032. It's now somewhere in the 2020s, like 2028, 2029. We don't know. We've spent, first of all, the earning capacity of people has gone down, so the revenues have come down. Plus, we've done these stimulus things, the trillions of dollars of stimulus on top of the tax cuts. Our fiscal situation in the last year went from 2032 being when we couldn't make out full payments to Social Security to now being 2028, 2029, maybe even earlier. So my forecast is no, we're not going to have a civil war, insurgency, or mass violence in 2021. But the time of risk has moved up 5 years. Instead of it being 2035 to 2040, it's now 2030 to 2035, which begins having a countdown that we are near 10 years out from where I see as a high-risk probability of an insurgency or civil war. We need to get our act together. We need to fix these problems and get our fiscal house in order. We need to get the radicalization under control, the ideological, and it takes, you got to do these things or we're going to be in a and it will continue to erode as we move into this. Now, the contingencies that will make it easier is if both sides cool off, right? If both sides say Trump dies or he goes away and that fades, and then all of a sudden they realize Biden wasn't the socialist that he was promised, because he's not, all of a sudden people go back, COVID's over, we have a good recovery because COVID's over in 2022, and people let the ideological rancor cool. That will be the best thing that can happen, right? Get that partisan rivalry down, and especially when it comes to these conspiracy theories. Likelihood of that happening? Not so great. The contingencies that can accelerate it, though, is if either side creates a permanent rigged effect. And we see this now as a game plan. The Republicans are basically saying, well, the state legislature should be able to disregard the popular vote and put in what they think is right because they're alleging fraud they haven't proven. Well, the reason those lawsuits failed is because those laws weren't on the books prior to the election. If the Republicans use, for example, the 2020 census results or the state legislatures they now control to put in place a permanent rig of the result, the blue side is going to look at that as a intolerable excessive step, and that risks violence. On the flip side, if you see massive court packing, and I'm not saying some sort of balancing, but if you see a bunch of Supreme Court justices get jammed through, or they disband the Electoral College and they say, ha ha ha, we're going to do the popular vote, that's also going to be perceived by the red as an intolerable encroachment of the blue. And so there's a lot of these scenarios where if people are like, well, screw you because you know, I don't like you anymore, and there's valid reasons for that, and they proceed on these things, it keeps escalating it, that could bring the whole thing forward, because if people begin to think they don't have a legitimate means of impacting the election, elections are always civil wars by other means. They are revolutions by nonviolent means. That's what it doesn't always mean it happens. Participation's big, but the purpose of an election is to avoid the violence. It gives you the ability to express a change without becoming violent. The fallback of an election that you feel is intolerably rigged against you is violence, and that's my concern. The other contingency that could accelerate is if the government itself uses mass violence against the people. That is a pure accelerant. If that happens, all bets are off. Again, it's not very likely. We've had some close calls, especially with the Trump administration. Again, I hope Biden is as boring a president as possible and just calms things down a little bit, gets us back from these conspiracy things of just, you know, imminent destruction and things like that, because we need to cool off. We got about 10 years. It's going to be hard enough as it is with climate change and everything else going on, but hopefully we'll pull out of that. So that's not a great forecast, but that's the forecast. Hey, no civil war next year, just some terrorism. Yeah, 2021 TP riots. That's possible, Mike says. Yeah, fair point, Jen. I used MOOCs as a proxy for online instructions because I'm an uneducated person. Online instruction is really what I'm talking about, not just MOOCs. And then Biden is not going to do that. I don't know what that is in reference to, but maybe it's in reference to someone else's comment. So we've got a few left. In fact, we got one left, and so we'll end on I was going to say easy note, but it's not really a happy note. So the last question 14. I got a lot of gaming and fandom fans out here, and the one thing On a Roll podcast, I know you guys are out there. I don't know if you're listening tonight. If you are, Happy New Year's. They invited me on, and they asked me, Tim, are we going to have Gen Con and Dragon Con this year? And I said, no. And I was right. So people ask me, are we going to have any gaming, fandom, or other conventions be able to held safely in 2021? And I hate to end on a low note, but the answer is no, based on the contingency that we don't have herd immunity to COVID-19. I mean, even if we have partial success, you know, think about this from a numbers standpoint, right? I said earlier, the international thing, as long as there is pandemic anywhere, there is pandemic everywhere. Even assuming you could get herd immunity, a gathering of 5,000 people has what? 24 international attendees? Lowball it. Maybe convention of 100,000 has what? 1,000? Now your herd immunity doesn't mean that it's going to, that means you should keep these major waves, but it doesn't mean that that convention is safe. You know, Legionnaire's disease is not something that spreads, you know, across the country. It hits conventions. And the safety factor, even with herd immunity, when you talk large conventions, 10,000, 20,000, 40, 80,000, 100,000 people in crammed areas, they're sweaty, they're in there for days. That is a COVID nightmare. And until we have, if not eradicated, significantly contained worldwide, at least in the major developed countries, I think you're going to see a lot of hesitancy from a liability standpoint, from a can we make enough revenue with people coming to be able to host these large gaming and fandom conventions. I just don't see it as happening. I don't see it as very likely. So I apologize for that, for everyone's looking forward for a gaming convention. Same thing with movies. I don't think theaters are going to open up back anytime soon. It's just too much of a risk. And those are the last things that are going to happen after we get herd immunity is we've got to really eradicate it before you can start having 100,000 people in cram locations for days at a time safely. All right, so that is it for the New Year's Eve 2021 Ask Me Anything. It's been real and it's been fun, but it may not have been real fun. I'm sorry the last half is a downer, but I promise to give you my best forecast, which is what I've done. So everyone, if you haven't yet, and this is going to be time delayed, but I'm raising a glass, and let's all violate the rules of the InfoMullet and engage in a little vulgarity and say, fuck you, 2020. Happy New Year's to 2021. Fuck you as well. That's where we're at. Please be safe, stay indoors, drink whatever you want because you're not going driving. I mean, if you are driving, drink responsibly, but we know you're not because you're good people. So get blitzed if you want. Watch that TV, play those games, play those board games, have that fun. You definitely deserve it. Take tomorrow off if you can. We got a long year ahead of us. It's not going to get better anytime soon. So to everyone, I wish I had better news, but I don't. Take care of yourself. And from Bonky, from Tim, Happy New Year's to goodbye to 2020 and Happy New Year's to 2021. Bye-bye. Thanks for watching the video. Hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to follow the InfoMullet, visit us on Facebook or Twitter. And if you'd like notifications when we post new video content, click on the red subscribe button below the video. If you've ever wanted to become a mulleteer and support the InfoMullet, visit us on Patreon. We appreciate the support.